Hey guys, in today's video, we'll be going over how to install the Flexa glass door hinge. The Flexa hinge is the non-hydraulic glass door hinge that we offer. Inside the box, there will be a hinge and a hinge cover plate. There will also be a plate pre-installed onto the hinge. Prior to installing the hinge, we'll need to remove this plate. When the plate is removed, there will be two cam-style bushings installed onto the hinge. We'll need to make sure that those cam bushings are on the hinge. The cam bushings will be used to adjust the door to the location we need it to be. There will also be glass door hinge plates that are sent. These hinge plates will install into the door jamb and will allow the door to be adjusted up and down to the location we need the door to be. Lastly, there'll be 1-inch self-tapping taper-headed screws. These screws will be used to anchor the hinge into the door jamb. Before getting started, I want to quickly go over the placement of the hinge on the door jamb. On the backing plate, you'll notice that there's a set screw offset to one side of the backing plate. The purpose of the set screw location is to properly locate the hinge on the door jamb. When we install the backing plates into the door jamb, we want to make sure the set screw is to the inside portion of the door jamb. As you can see, once the hinge is installed, the set screw is in the center hole of the hinge, and the two open holes are overlapping the door jamb. When we go to install our anchoring screws, they're going to go in these two open holes. The anchoring screws will anchor the hinge to the door jamb. When installing the Flexa hinges, we have found it easier to pre-install the hinges onto the door before standing the door up. This will allow us to properly install the hinge onto the door before attaching it to the door jamb. With the Flexa hinge pre-installed, all we'll need to do is stand the door up and attach it to the backing plates into the door jamb. Before installing the hinge onto the door, we'll need to determine which side of the door the hinge needs to be installed on. This will be dependent on the swing of the door. We need to have the main body section of the hinge on the inside of the room the door is swinging into. To install the hinge, place the hinge into the holes on the door. This is the most important part when installing Flexa hinges. On the cam bushings, there's a thin side and a thick side. You need to make sure that the thin side is towards the edge of the door. What this allows is it allows the glass door to be pulled away from the plate on the hinge. If the cams are not oriented correctly, it will cause the door to bind up on the hinge and not open properly. Once we have the bushings in there correctly, we then can press the hinge up towards the inside of the holes. Again, we're trying to create a distance between the edge of the door and the plate on the hinge. Once we have the hinge in the correct position, we can then take the other hinge plate and place it over the holes and run the bolts through the plate and into the hinge. With the bolts installed, we can then take a quick square, place it on the edge of the door, and square up the hinge on the door. With the hinge square, we can then tighten the bolts. With one hinge installed, we'll go ahead and repeat the process for the other hinge or hinges on the door. When installing the door, we recommend having at least 2 people to install the door. One person will handle the door, while the other person will install the backing plates into the door jamb and attach the hinge to the backing plates. To install the door, place the door onto the door jambs. You will then align the hinge with the backing plates. And as a reminder, we want the set screw to be towards the inside portion of the door jamb. Once the backing plates are in place, you can then line up the hinge with the hole in the backing plate and install the set screw. Once the backing plate is in place, the door will be secured to the door jamb. With the door attached to the backing plates, it will allow you to adjust for the height the door needs to be set at. Our glass door height calculation allows for a 1/2 inch gap between the floor and the bottom of the door and a 1/4 inch gap between the top of the door and the inside of the door header. To set the height of the door, we recommend placing a shim under the door at the height needed. Once you have the height set, you can then tighten the set screws in the backing plate to hold the door in place. Now, if you wanted to try to use the door to make sure that the height is correct, you can tighten the set screws and remove the shim from underneath the door. You can then open and close the door to make sure it's got good clearance at the floor and that the top of the door is within the door header. Now, there may be a situation where the backing plates cannot hold the weight of the door and they may slip down when trying to use the door. If you run into that situation, you can leave the shim underneath the door and make sure that the door is at the correct height. And then from there, you can go ahead and anchor the hinge to the door jamb. Then you can remove the shim from under the door. With the door height set, we can now anchor the hinge to the door jamb. Before anchoring the hinge to the door jamb, you need to make sure that the hinge is square on the door jamb. You can do this by looking at the holes on the hinge and making sure that the holes are in the same location on the door jamb. If the hinge is out of square, all you'll need to do is loosen up the bolts on the hinge and square up the hinge, which will square up this plate. With the hinge in the correct location, you can then pre-drill holes into the door jamb through the 2 open holes on the hinge using an 1/8 inch drill bit. Once the holes are pre-drilled, you can then attach the hinge to the door jamb using the 1 inch attaching screws. With the anchoring screws installed, the door should open and close freely. Now, if you run into a situation where the door is binding up on the hinge, you'll need to remove the plates from the hinge and make sure that the cams are orientated correctly. As discussed earlier, it's important to make sure that the smaller side of the cam is towards the door jamb. That way, the door is pulled away from those hinges. So once the door is installed, the last thing we'll need to do is we'll need to install the cover plate onto the hinge. And to do that, all we have to do is place the cover plate onto the hinge and press it onto the hinge. With the cover plate installed, the installation of the Flexa hinges is complete.